Joining us now on the Faulkner Show is retired Lieutenant Colonel David Redman, a distinguished veteran and the former Alberta Emergency Management Leader who oversaw critical disaster responses and international military operations. In the C2C Journal, David Redman has recently published an article titled "Unfit for Duty, It is Time to Rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces." Sir, thank you so much for joining us, and let's just get right into this. How do we go about rebuilding the military? What's it going to take?
All right. That's why I wrote the article, and C2C graciously published it. In the article, what I did in the first half is I defined the problem. And in the military, you're told never to come with a problem unless you have a solution. So the first half, I defined how we got there and its terrible results. In the second half, I defined very clearly what is the statement of requirement, all of the pieces that are needed to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces, and then a very detailed process to lay out how we can restore the Canadian Armed Forces, starting within the first year, but overall in 3 years.
So we know that right now we are well short of that 2% of GDP spending on our national defense, that NATO requirement. The argument that we've heard from the current defense minister, Bill Blair, is that it's one thing to find the money, but it's an entirely different thing to figure out where to put that money. Where exactly should the money go? Where should we spend that money first when it becomes available to spend on national defense?
So that's why I take the time in the article to define the 5 pieces, the statement of requirement. And number 1 is purpose. The government of Canada and the people of Canada need to define what they want for our country. So I want to take you back. I published an article last March in Frontier Centre for Public Policy on the status of our country, Canada. Canada and all democracies are built on 6 national interests. Now, when I was a young officer cadet in the Royal Military College of Canada back in the very early 1970s, we were taught the national interests of our country and were required to pass examinations on them because as an officer in the Army, we were going to be deployed all over the world and we would need to describe to people who Canada was. So in that first article back in March, I laid out those 6 national interests: unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms, economic prosperity and growth, and personal well-being and growth. And each of those must be defined. And in that one on national security, the Canadian Armed Forces is but one element of national security. Canada as a nation needs to define where it wants to be in the world. And I think most Canadians want a vision of Canada that existed before 2015. One where Canada was strong and independent internally with a prosperous economy, but that had a standing in the world where our voice was at least relevant. And in that first article, I said loss of relevance. And so the first step in rebuilding the Canadian Armed Forces is to find its purpose. Is it solely to be a backup to police forces in our country? Or is it to actually do what an armed forces is for, which is to fight? So the first statement is we must define our purpose. And when I was an officer in the Army, our purpose was number 1, national sovereignty. Number 2, defense of NORAD, the North American continent. Number 3, support of our allies where it was in Canada's national interest, NATO being one of them, but things like ABCA, the American, British, Canadian, Australian partnership that we're now excluded from. Those were the types of things that were the number 1, 2, and 3 roles of the Canadian Armed Forces, but at the base of it all was that we needed an Army, Navy, and an Air Force that could fight. All right, so define the purpose. You're asking me where to spend the money. Once you define the purpose, the money becomes much more clear because the number 1 item next, as you'll see in my paper, is personnel. And people are the most important element in an armed forces. The ability to fight depends on having people trained and constantly exercised to be ready to fight. And anything that takes away from that number 1 mission is a waste of taxpayers' money. There's lots of people that can come in fires and floods to help people in all our provinces and territories in Canada that don't carry rifles, that don't fly jets, and that don't sail ships. We need an armed forces to fight. So once you've defined the people and you have a fighting force that's combat capable, the third step then is their equipment and supplies. And the equipment and supplies goes with the purpose. So if it's Arctic sovereignty, defense of North America, and support of our allies in NATO, we need to be combat equipped to match those mission statements. That's why in the paper I lay out in the last part the exact step-by-step process to assign a task force, to define each of those primary elements, and then to walk that process in 3 months to a plan, which then is implemented over the next 3 years. You can't just pull things out of the sky like we saw our previous Prime Minister do when he announced 12 diesel submarines. He picked 12 simply to get a magic number that equaled 2%, with absolutely no definition of what their purpose would be, how they would deploy, whether they were good under Arctic ice. He simply picked a number to try and get all the tigers that were at the doors beating him up for the 2% away from his doors. There was absolutely no concept.
I think it's pretty obvious to everyone, unless you happen to be perhaps a member of the Justin Trudeau cabinet, that a functioning country requires a functioning military, a military that is capable to do its job. One thing we've heard from the federal government is that they believe climate change spending is part of national defense spending. When they're asked about why they don't spend much on national defense, they say, well, look at how much we're spending on climate change, which we believe to be a national security issue. Where does that ideology come from? And is it your belief that the federal government genuinely doesn't care about funding the military?
All right, so number one, the first part of your question was every country that's credible has an army. The very first line in my paper is a quote from ancient Greece. Every country has an army, theirs or somebody else's. So if you don't have an army, you don't have national security, you don't have a country anymore. We've heard those exact words coming out of President-elect Trump's mouth in the last 2 days. So number one, you have to have a standing army, Navy, and Air Force that is defined to match the purpose of your country. I put it to you that back in 1965, and take you back for a little bit of history here, 1965, we had an armed forces of 105,000, Army, Navy, and Air Force combined. We now hear people like Bill Blair talk about the fact that he'd really like one day maybe to be able to get to 71,000, even though we're currently sitting at under 35,000 operational, capably deployable troops. This isn't the first time we've been here. So I want to go back to the point about fighting. I was asked to testify in front of the National Standing Committee on Defense in October of 2022, because at that time, this whole climate change discussion really started in earnest. It started long before, but in earnest, directed straight at the CAF, it was then. And I was asked to testify because I wear two hats in my past life. I was an officer in the Army, deployed around the world, 19 houses in 27 years all over the globe. And in my second career, I ran emergency management in Alberta, but first of all, immediately following September 11th, on September the 12th, I was asked by the Premier of Alberta to lead the Task Force on Security, which wrote the counterterrorism plan for Alberta, wherein we proved to the United States that Alberta took security seriously. You might remember a guy named Paul Salucci. He was the ambassador to Canada at the time, and I personally briefed him one-on-one for 2 hours. And he started the briefing with security trumps trade. Remember those words? Heard them recently? I proved to him in 2 hours that we took security seriously at that time in the province of Alberta. I briefed congressmen in their offices in the U.S. Capitol. I briefed senators in their offices in the U.S. Capitol. And I briefed the first three directors in the new Department of Homeland Security. And they walked away content that our trade was secure. So the Armed Forces of Canada is but one piece of that. What we've seen is an erosion of all of national security, our intelligence services and trust in them, our border services and trust in them, our Coast Guard and trust in them, our national police forces, our provincial police forces and trust in them. We have a huge job, not just the Canadian Armed Forces, but we have to reestablish that we are a credible trading partner, not just for our largest partner to the south, but all of our partners in the free world. And so first we need to define the purpose, and then we need to be serious and do it. And this whole 2%, NATO's now talking 3%. So when I started off with, we were 105,000. Trudeau Sr., Pierre Trudeau, reduced the armed forces of Canada to 70,000 and thought he was going to remove all our forces from NATO till NATO told him, no troops, no trade. That was in 1972 when I joined the Army. We're now in exactly the same boat. If we don't step up our armed forces, the first two of the national interests of our country are unity, national security. Without the first two, you can forget the other four. And we have destroyed our unity in the past 9 years, and we've watched the government intentionally try and fragment the Canadian people. And then number two, national security, we've watched them destroy every element of national. We still have a list of known MPs who have done foreign interference in our government, and we don't know their names.
Absolutely.
So the Canadian Armed Forces is the canary in the coal mine. They are dead, but they are showing that our whole national security is in the same boat. And when a Minister of National Defense thinks maybe one day he might get to 71,000 soldiers back in the armed forces, I put it to you that if we had 105 in uniform members in the CAF in 1965 with a population of Canada of 20 million, with a population of 40 million, we should at least have 200,000 in uniform to meet our obligations to our alliances, but far more importantly, to meet the national security sovereignty tasks of our own country, our three coastlines, and our landmass.
So let's get into that, because we are a long way off of that target and we are well behind in developing our national defense. But what are those threats right now, domestic threats that are facing this country that require the national attention, whether it be through the military or through other avenues? What are those threats?
All right, that's the first step in any estimate of the situation or in the operational planning process is you do the threat analysis. The largest threat to the free world, and Canada in particular, is China. We need to stop thinking of China as a trading partner. They ceased being that about 10 years ago, maybe 15. The point I make with China is the Silk Road Initiative is how China has infiltrated over 140 countries of the world and taken over the United Nations, and now funds directly into Canada foreign interference in our election, in our economy, in every daily walk of our life. The fact that we've got a foreign interference inquiry that has been silenced is unacceptable and is part of this government's decisions. They've decided to intentionally do this. Again, we have members of parliament who are known by our intelligence agencies to have been involved in foreign interference in our country. So China is our number one threat, and through them, they dominate the United Nations. Number two in my book, to Canada, is Iran and the IRGC, who is funding activists all over our country, which is directly targeting our citizens, and which is marching in the streets calling death to all Jews, death to all Christians, and death to Canada. If that's not a blatant national security threat brought about by the world knowing Canada is basically an open and porous border system and an immigration system which has allowed them to pour into our countries. So number one, China. Number two, Iran. And then I get to Russia. And Russia's way down the list. It's an order of magnitude lower, in my opinion. Russia has its own problems, and what's happening in Europe shows that Russia has already been contained to a large degree and can be managed. If we don't deal with China and Iran as our number one and number two threats and the daily activities they're doing in our country, then our national sovereignty is a joke.
The question that I ask veterans and experts on the military who have been in uniform is what you think it will take to try to encourage more Canadians to join the military, to serve the country, because we know there's an attrition crisis. There's not only a failure at being able to recruit new members, but the good ones are leaving, the officers are leaving, the NCOs are leaving. What do you think it will take to get Canadians to want to sign up and wear the uniform and defend the country?
Okay, the paper defines that very clearly, but let me do it in two parts. First of all, let me give you the history again. I joined the Army in 1972. Think about the world in 1972. The Vietnam War was still raging and was winding down. The United States was trying to find a way to get out of there without losing too much face. In Canada, we had draft dodgers living all through our country that had escaped the Vietnam War, and I chose to join the Army. Do you think that was a popular thing to do in 1972 in Canada? It wasn't. My first platoon had 85 all ranks in it. I had 5 warrant officers, 1 sergeant, 1 master corporal, and 1 corporal, and the remainder, just under 80, were all privates because Pierre Trudeau had stopped all recruiting into the Canadian Forces, and yet young soldiers, men and women, still joined. They joined for a number of reasons, as I define in the paper, but number one, they joined to be part of a capable fighting force. When you join in armed forces, Army, Navy, or Air Force, you know you are joining with unlimited liability to fight for your country. When you join and you find out that that's a joke, that you don't have equipment, that you're not training for that DEI is more important than combat capability, you leave. We have a hollowed out armed forces. We have some senior veterans who have stayed on hoping that there will be a new government and they can be part of the training cadre to rebuild. So how do you keep people in an armed forces? You let them do what they joined for. You give them the tools and equipment to do it. I left the Army in absolute rage in 1999. I was promoted to full colonel and I was posted to my dream job. I have the proof of all of this. I wrote a 4-page letter to the Chief of the Defence Staff and the Prime Minister of Canada, who is Jean Chrétien, explaining why I was leaving, that they had betrayed the young men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who had joined to defend their country. We are in exactly the same position again. So I lived through the rebuilding from Pierre Trudeau. I left with no job and no future from a job that the only job I'd ever wanted was to be an Army officer. I left because I could no longer lie to the young men and women who were joining. We are back in that same situation again after 9 years of Justin Trudeau. We can rebuild again. And in the paper, as I say, I define the step-by-step process. But first, we need a government who will champion the Armed Forces of Canada and who will assign a leader of a task force whose sole focus for the next 3 years is the rebuilding of the armed forces. But I put it to you, there needs to be an equal champion for all of national security.
I couldn't agree more with you, and I'm sure the audience agrees with you as well, Colonel. The article in the C2C Journal is Unfit for Duty. It is time to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces. A link to that you can find in the description of this video. That is all the time we have for today. Colonel Redman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.